Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Road to the Civil War. In the last lecture, we looked at how the Mexican War caused a sectional division over slavery in the territories and how the Compromise of 1850 was supposedly the final settlement on the issue. However, the part of the compromise known as the Fugitive Slave Law only widened that sectional division in the 1850s. Now, the law was designed to help Southerners reclaim their slaves that escaped to freedom in the North, and Southerners believed it was the only measure of the compromise that sought to guarantee their rights. Enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law would agitate Northerners to agree never before reached on the issue of slavery. Now, the Fugitive Slave Law put the burden of proof on captured blacks, but it gave them no legal power to prove their freedom. They were not allowed to testify on their behalf. In reality, though, the number of fugitive slaves returned to slavery was small. Only about 330 slaves out of 4 million enslaved African Americans were returned to slavery under the Fugitive Slave Law during the 1850s. But the presence of slave catchers in the North hunting down runaways would bring Northerners in contact with slavery in a way they had never been before. The North responds to the Fugitive Slave Law with something called personal liberty laws. These laws gave fugitive slaves various rights, such as the rights of testimony, habeas corpus, and trial by jury. They also enacted criminal penalties for kidnapping blacks. In some places in the North, it's difficult to capture runaway slaves because of the hostile opinion towards slavery. Blacks and whites even worked together to block the capture of fugitive slaves, and they worked with the Underground Railroad to help guide escaped slaves to freedom, and this really upset Northerners. Some of this abolitionist behavior did cause a backlash in the North. A number of states passed exclusion laws, which were laws that banned the immigration of blacks, either free or slave, to their state. Indiana and Iowa did this in 1851, and Illinois did it in 1853. Now, there's many examples of slaves escaping slavery and then slave catchers coming north to reclaim them, but I'm only going to share two with you, the story of Anthony Burns and the story of Margaret Garner. There's whole books written on this topic, so if you want to read more, I would suggest Eric Foner's History of Black Americans or Stanley Campbell's Slave Catchers. They have a lot of stories similar to the one I'm about to share. Now, Anthony Burns escaped from slavery in Virginia in March of 1854 aboard a ship, which took him to Boston, where he found work. He ended up writing a letter to his brother, who was still in the South, and this allowed his master to track down where Burns was. And in May of 1854, Burns is arrested. Abolitionists tried to rescue Burns by attacking the courthouse, and as a result, one deputy was killed, but the rescue failed. President Franklin Pierce ordered several companies of Marines, some cavalry and artillery to Boston, and along with the state militia and local police, they kept the peace while a federal commissioner determined Burns' fate. Pierce wired the district attorney in Boston, quote, "incur any expense to ensure the execution of the law." Pierce also ordered a revenue cutter on standby to carry Burns back to Virginia, and in June of 1854, troops marched Burns to the ship to be taken back into slavery. The streets of Boston were lined with people protesting Burns' return to slavery. Church bells rang and buildings were draped in black. The American flag was hung upside down. Boston hadn't seen this much commotion since the Boston Tea Party back during the American Revolution. Pierce returned Anthony Burns to slavery at a cost of $100,000 to the federal government. And the incident had a profound effect on many people. A Whig who formerly supported slavery said this: "When it was all over and I was left alone in my office, I put my face in my hands and wept. I could do nothing less." Amos Lawrence, who's also kind of an abolitionist activist in the North, he said, "We went to bed one night old-fashioned, conservative, compromise Union Whigs, and we woke up stark mad abolitionists." So the Fugitive Slave Law starts to change a lot of people's opinions about slavery. Now, Margaret Garner was a slave who escaped from slavery with her husband and 4 children in January of 1856 by fleeing from Kentucky to Ohio. As a posse was about to capture her family, Margaret killed one of her daughters with a kitchen knife and tried to kill the others because she didn't want them to return to slavery. A federal judge ordered them back to Kentucky, where they were sold down the Ohio River and the Mississippi River to New Orleans. So the Fugitive Slave Law ends up turning many pacifists into fighters. Frederick Douglass said, "The only way to make the Fugitive Slave Law a dead letter is to make half a dozen or more dead kidnappers." While this is going on, the Fugitive Slave Law is also having an impact on politics in the North. Northern Whigs were having a hard time defending the law that Southern Whigs had supported, and many radical Whigs are winning election. Thaddeus Stevens, George W. Julian, and Benjamin Wade are just three examples. These three men will be famous later on during the Civil War. Now, many Southerners are really upset that the North is resisting the Fugitive Slave Law. Usually, Southerners are painted as the supporters of states' rights, while Northerners support a strong central government, but here the roles are reversed. Now, many states adopted something called the Georgia Platform. This platform stated that though the South did not wholly approve of the Compromise of 1850, it would abide by it as a permanent settlement of this sectional controversy so long as the North did likewise. But if slavery is opposed in the District of Columbia, or new slave states are not admitted, or slavery is not recognized in a new territory, these southern states would resist with secession as a last resort. Above all, upon a faithful execution of the Fugitive Slave Law depends the preservation of our much beloved Union. Now, another thing that helped widen the sectional tension was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Stowe was the daughter, sister, and wife of Congregational clergymen. According to Harriet Beecher Stowe, God and the Fugitive Slave Law inspired her book. She drew on her observances of slavery in Kentucky and her experiences with runaway slaves in Ohio. James McPherson writes in The Battle Cry of Freedom, "She aimed the novel at the evangelical conscience of the North, and she hit her mark." Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin was originally published in the National Era in a series form, but then it came out as a book in 1852. Within a decade, it sold 2 million copies. It was popular in the North and Great Britain and was translated into many languages. Uncle Tom's Cabin told the story of Eliza, a runaway slave, and Tom, a slave who endures the beatings of Simon Legree. Now, during the Civil War, Lincoln met Stowe, and he supposedly said to her, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." So it does have an impact on the country. Now, the South is outraged by the book, and they attempt to ban it in the South. Within a couple years, pro-slavery writers in the South had answered Uncle Tom's Cabins with a number of other books. They argued that the slaves were better off than free workers in the North. One title shows this. One book was called Uncle Robin in His Cabin in Virginia and Tom Without One in Boston. So basically arguing that when slaves get too old to work, their masters still take care of them with food and shelter and clothing. But in the North, when you get too old to work, they just kind of cast you aside. Now, the South didn't just stay on the defensive during the 1850s over the issue of slavery. They went on the offense. The South pushed to reopen the international slave trade and to purchase or conquer new lands for slavery. Some fire eaters tried to circumvent the ban on the international slave trade. Charles A. Lamar and his ship, the Wanderer, collected 500 African slaves and then sailed back to Georgia in 1858. Lamar was arrested, but he wasn't convicted. There were multiple attempts to annex or conquer Cuba and parts of Central America during the 1850s. In 1853, the Gadsden Purchase occurred, in which the Pierce administration purchased a strip of land from Mexico. Diplomats within the Pierce administration announced something called the Ostend Manifesto in 1854. It said that the acquisition of Cuba was necessary to the United States. Cuba is as necessary to the North American Republic as any of its present family of states, the manifesto read. One of the most interesting movements of the 1850s was the filibustering movement. This was basically Southerners attempting to conquer new lands for slavery. One attempt was made by William J. Crittenden of Kentucky in 1851. He and 400 some Southern volunteers left New Orleans in 1851 for Cuba in an attempt to conquer the island. Now, the Spanish who ruled Cuba were waiting for him, and they killed over 200 American filibusters and captured the rest. They sent 160 to Spain as prisoners, publicly garroting others and executing 50, including Crittenden, by public firing squad. Now, many in the South wanted intervention, but the Fillmore administration quietly worked with Spain to get the American prisoners released. The most successful American filibuster of the 19th century was William Walker. If you want to read about him, there's a great book called Freebooters Must Die: The Life and Death of William Walker, the most notorious soldier of fortune of the 19th century. It's quite a long title. Now, he went on filibustering expeditions south of the border. At one point, he conquered Nicaragua, or at least parts of it, and proclaimed himself president of Nicaragua. His luck eventually ran out, and he was executed by a Honduras firing squad after he was captured on one of these expeditions. Walker and others left a legacy on the United States. Their expeditions did. When the crisis of secession was going on in 1860 and 1861, Senator John Crittenden suggested extending the Missouri Compromise to the Pacific Ocean, but Abraham Lincoln responded with this: "It would amount to a perpetual covenant of war against every people, tribe, and state owning a foot of land between here and Tierra del Fuego." So basically saying, if we extend the Missouri Compromise to the Pacific Ocean, everything south of that, places in Mexico, Central and South America, will just be open to people who want to conquer it for slavery. Okay, let's get back to some of the politics of the 1850s. 1852 would be the last year the Whigs contested a presidential election. Millard Fillmore's efforts to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law won him support from Southern Whigs, but it alienated anti-slavery Whigs in the North. Winfield Scott ends up receiving the Whig nomination in 1852. The Whig platform pledged to support the Compromise of 1850, but many Southern Whigs were suspicious of Winfield Scott and his commitment to that compromise. If you remember, Southern Whigs supported President Taylor, but he turned out to be an anti-slavery Whig, so now they're kind of suspicious of Scott. 9 Southern Whig congressmen, led by Alexander Stephens and Robert Toombs, refused to back Scott. Now, the Democrat Party strongly supported the Compromise of 1850. They reiterated that Congress had no power to interfere with slavery except to help return fugitive slaves to their masters. Southern Democrats blocked Stephen A. Douglas and Lewis Cass because they had supported popular sovereignty. The candidate favored by Southerners, James Buchanan, was also blocked from getting the nomination. So what you have is Franklin Pierce, a New Hampshire Democrat, a former senator, a veteran of the Mexican War. He ends up winning the nomination. And the Democrats win in a landslide in 1852, 254 to 42 electoral votes, over 50% of the popular vote to 49%. They carried 27 states to 4. So basically what happened is, on election day, Southern Whigs desert Scott and they vote for the Democrat candidate. Scott wins 35% of the popular vote in the South, whereas Taylor 4 years earlier had won 50%. And he carried only Tennessee and Kentucky among the slave states, whereas Taylor had carried 8 slave states in 1848. If you add up the future 11 states of the Confederacy, the Whigs in 1852 elected no governors and only 14 of 65 congressmen, and only controlled the Tennessee legislature. After the election, Alexander Stephens pronounced, "The Whig Party is dead." Now, the Pierce administration pleased Southerners. Despite failing to acquire Cuba, Pierce did enforce the Fugitive Slave Law, and he did open up the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase to slavery. This was the most important event during the Pierce administration, the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. James McPherson writes that the passage of Kansas-Nebraska may have been the most important single event pushing the nation towards the Civil War. Kansas-Nebraska finished off the Whig Party and gave birth to a new, entirely northern Republican Party. Now, settlers had been moving west, and many wanted to build a transcontinental railroad through the western territories. Southerners, however, were not eager to have a transcontinental railroad north of the Missouri Compromise line because that would just lead to more free states, they thought. They preferred a southern route for a transcontinental railroad. Now, 2 Democrats, William A. Richardson and Stephen A. Douglas, both from Illinois, they're chairman of the House and Senate Committee on Territories. In 1853, the 2 Democrats introduced bills to organize the Nebraska Territory, which is mostly north of the Missouri Compromise line. The House approves the bill, but Southerners in the Senate kill it in March 1853. They fear that Nebraska will just be surrounded by free states and therefore become a free state itself. Missouri Democrat Senator David Atchison, he said that he would see Nebraska sink in hell before voting to organize free soil. Douglas would have to give Southerners some incentive to support his Kansas-Nebraska bill, so he ends up taking that step. Douglas knew that this would, quote, raise a hell of a storm in the North, but he took the fateful step of repealing the Missouri Compromise and organizing two territories, Nebraska and Kansas. He pushed this bill through the Senate, and with the help of Georgia Whig Alexander Stephens in the House, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed and signed into law by President Pierce in May of 1854. The reaction in the North was shock and outrage. Hundreds of anti-Nebraska meetings took place, and they sent resolutions and petitions to Congress. In the first months of 1854, out of 10 northern state legislatures, 5 that were controlled by Whigs denounced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and 4 that were controlled by Democrats refused to endorse it. Only Illinois, Douglas's home state, endorsed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Whig senator from Maine, William Pitt Fessenden, said this: the Kansas-Nebraska Act is a terrible outrage. The more I look at it, the more enraged I become. It needs but little to make me an out-and-out abolitionist. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska bill helps to kill the intersectional party system. Every northern Whig in the two houses voted against the bill, while 25 of 34 southern Whigs voted for it. Of 75 southern Democrats, 72 voted for it, while 49 of 108 northern Whigs voted against it. So though not every Whig opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act and every Democrat supported it, you did have a voting pattern based on sections. Democrats and Whigs in the South tended to support it, while Democrats and Whigs in the North tended to oppose it. Although overall, more Democrats supported it and more Whigs opposed it. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act also caused northern Whigs and southern Whigs to part ways, weakening the Whigs in the South and killing the Whigs in the North. Whig Senator Truman Smith of Connecticut said, "The Whig Party has been killed off effectually by that miserable Nebraska business. We Whigs of the North are unalterably determined never to even have the slightest political correspondence or connection with Southern Whigs." And the question became, who's going to pick up the pieces of the broken political system? New anti-slavery coalitions formed throughout the North, all under different names. There were anti-Nebraska parties, there were fusion parties, there were People's Independent parties, and then there was Republican parties. And the Republican Party is what stuck in the North. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, campaigns in the North were intense and bitter. Douglas spoke in Chicago in September of 1854. He defended the Kansas-Nebraska Act while the crowd heckled him. He insulted the crowd, and he said that he would silence the mob or stay till morning speaking. Douglas shouted at the crowd for hours, and the crowd shouted at him for hours. And at some point early on Sunday morning, he told the crowd this: "It is now Sunday morning. I'll go to church and you can go to hell." He shook his fist at the crowd and left the stage. In October of 1854, Abraham Lincoln, who became involved in politics again because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he spoke publicly about his views on slavery. Lincoln argued that the Founding Fathers had opposed slavery. This was evident if you read the Declaration of Independence or the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Even the Constitution, which protected slavery, did not actually use the word slavery because the founders were embarrassed of it. Lincoln said this: "Thus the thing," meaning slavery, "is hid away in the Constitution, just as an afflicted man hides away a cancer which he dares not cut out at once, lest he bleed to death, with the promise, nevertheless, that the cutting may begin at the end of a given time." Now, the first step to prevent the spread of this cancer, slavery, was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which the founders did. Then the prohibition of the African slave trade occurred in the early 1800s, and then in 1820 the Missouri Compromise was passed. So the founding generation took a number of steps to limit slavery. The next step was to begin the process of gradual emancipation where slavery did exist. The Founding Fathers generation had done this, and all the states north of Maryland had abolished slavery by this time. Now, Lincoln did not want to pass judgment on the South. He said, When they tell us that they are no more responsible for the origin of slavery than we, meaning Northerners, I acknowledge the fact. They are just what we would be in their situation. When it is said that the institution exists and that it is very difficult to get rid of, I acknowledge this fact. For Lincoln, it all comes down to his belief that the American values of republicanism and self-government were incompatible with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Let no one be deceived. The spirit of 76 and the spirit of Nebraska are utter antagonisms. Little by little, we have been giving up the old for the new faith. Nearly 80 years ago, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. But now, from that beginning, we have run down to the other declaration that for some men to enslave others is a sacred right of self-government. These principles cannot stand together. Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us repurify it. Let us readopt the Declaration of Independence, and with it the practices and policy which harmonize it. If we do this, we shall not only have saved the Union, but we shall so saved it as to make it and to keep it forever worthy of saving. Now, Stephen Douglas pushed back on Lincoln and the Republicans. He acknowledged that the founders did exclude slavery from the Northwest Territory, but while they did that, they also allowed it to spread to the Southwest Territories, which in turn became 7 new slave states. This is not going to be the last time Lincoln and Douglas clash over the issue of slavery. So Lincoln, his speeches expressed the platform of the new Republican Party. You know, slavery should be opposed because it's morally reprehensible. The national government does have a right and duty to exclude slavery from the territories, and slavery must eventually be abolished where it exists. The Democrats pay a heavy price in the 1854 elections for their support for Kansas-Nebraska. In 1852, before this law is passed, the Democrats had carried all but 2 northern state legislatures in the elections, but in 1854 they lost control of all but 2. Northern Democrats in the House fell from 93 to 23, and a coalition of opponents to the Democrats would control the next House of Representatives. But the anti-Kansas-Nebraska factions were not necessarily united. For a while, it seems that the Republican Party will have to compete with this other new political party called the Know-Nothing Party, sometimes the American Party. But the Know-Nothings also break up over the issue of slavery. Southern Know-Nothings support slavery, and Northern Know-Nothings oppose it. This allows the Republican Party to sweep the Northern Know-Nothings into their own party. Know-Nothings tended to favor less immigration, a longer period to become a citizen, and restrictions on voting rights and running for office rights until immigrants had become citizens and lived in the United States a long time. Now, the next big event on the road to the Civil War is something called Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas is basically where anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces battle it out on the prairie. They battle at the ballot box with cannons, guns, swords, and knives. During the passage of Kansas-Nebraska, William Seward said this: "Since there is no escaping your challenge, I accept it in behalf of the cause of freedom. We will engage in competition for the virgin soil of Kansas, and God give victory to the side which is stronger in numbers as it is in right." The New England Immigrant Aid Company was formed in the summer of 1854 with financial backing from Amos Lawrence, and the goal was to promote free soil settlements in Kansas. So while anti-slavery men are preparing to go to Kansas and to do battle, so are pro-slavery men. Missouri, the slave state next door to Kansas, had more pro-slavery men than Kansas had free soil men, and they were just as determined to make Kansas a slave state as free soilers were to make it a free state. In November of 1854, border ruffians, these are pro-slavery Missourians, the border ruffians stormed the state of Kansas and helped elect a pro-slavery territorial delegate to Congress. In March of 1855, about 5,000 border ruffians helped to elect a pro-slavery territorial legislature in Kansas. Now, this legislature then enacts a harsh slave code, which included fines and imprisonment for speaking out against slavery, the death penalty for encouraging slave revolts or helping slaves to escape their masters, and required all voters in Kansas to take an oath to uphold these laws. Now, the governor of Kansas knew the election had not been fair, so he ordered new elections in some districts, and Free Soilers end up winning these elections. But then a crisis occurs when the territorial legislature meets in July of 1855. They seat the original pro-slavery winners of the elections. The Free Soilers organize a convention in Topeka then in October of 1855, and they draw up a free state constitution. They also call for elections for a new legislature and governor. So what ends up happening is by January of 1856, Kansas has two territorial governments, a pro-slavery government at Lecompton and then a free soil government at Topeka. Violence continues throughout Kansas. The town of Lawrence is sacked by pro-slavery men in May of 1856. Two newspaper offices are destroyed. The hotel is burned. The home of the free soil governor is burned. Shops and houses are plundered. Now, while this violence is occurring out in Kansas, violence is also occurring in Washington, D.C. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts had been working on an anti-slavery speech all summer. And on May 19th and 20th, 1856, he gives his speech called The Crime Against Kansas. He said that murderous robbers from Missouri, hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization, had committed a rape of a virgin territory, compelling it to the hateful embrace of slavery. Sumner called out South Carolina's Andrew P. Butler. Butler had chosen a mistress to whom he had made his vows, and who, though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight, the harlot slavery. Now, the speech produced an uproar in the Senate. Many Southerners wanted to challenge Sumner to a duel. Congressman Preston Brooks, who was a cousin of Andrew Butler, he took action. On May 22nd, Brooks walked into a nearly empty Senate chamber and he walked up to Sumner's desk. "Your speech is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine." Sumner starts to rise, and then Brooks starts to beat him over the head with a golden-headed cane. He hits him at least 30 times. Sumner struggles to free himself. His legs were trapped under the desks, which were bolted to the floor. He eventually ripped the desk up and freed himself. He's drenched in blood. Northerners reacted with horror at what they considered an uncivilized and brutal attack on Senator Sumner. The House voted to expel Brooks, but fell short of the two-thirds requirement. So Brooks resigned his seat, but then he's voted back in by the South Carolinians in the next election. Southerners celebrated his attacks on Sumner. They asked for pieces of the cane as if it were some sort of religious relic. Southerners also sent Brooks new canes with notes such as "hit him again." Sumner was so injured that he was absent from the Senate for most of the next 4 years, although he was reelected as a symbolic rebuke to the barbarisms of the slave power. Now, back out in Kansas, the violence continued. The radical abolitionist John Brown began to make a name for himself. He heard of the caning of Charles Sumner shortly after it occurred, and it drove him to retaliation. On the night of May 24th, 1856, Brown, his sons, and some other anti-slavery men, they kidnapped 5 pro-slavery settlers in Kansas, and they murdered them with broadswords by hacking them to death. Brown was never punished for these murders, which became known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. The sacking of Lawrence and the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre escalated the bushwhacking in Kansas. The Civil War in Kansas shaped the context for the presidential election of 1856. Now, the 1856 presidential election would be the first time the Republican Party would run a candidate for president. They nominated the Pathfinder John C. Fremont. The Republican convention condemned the Pierce administration's policy in Kansas. They asserted the right of Congress to ban slavery in the territories. They called for admission of Kansas as a free state. They denounced the Austin Manifesto. They appealed to the Declaration of Independence. The platform also included support for internal improvements such as a transcontinental railroad and rivers and harbors improvements, and the platform rebuked nativism. The Democrats had a number of candidates to choose from: Franklin Pierce, Stephen A. Douglas, or James Buchanan. James Buchanan looked attractive because he had been in Great Britain during the whole Bleeding Kansas fiasco, so he had no responsibility for it. Pierce and Douglas get support from the South, but Buchanan gets support from the North because he's a Pennsylvanian, and Buchanan ends up winning the nomination. Buchanan was 65 years old. He was a bachelor. He had held so many offices that he's known as Old Public Functionary. He was a congressman for a decade, a senator for a decade. He had been minister to Russia and Great Britain. He'd also been Secretary of State. The Democrat platform in 1856 endorsed popular sovereignty. It condemned the Republicans as a sectional party. They endorsed states' rights and a limited power for the federal government. They called for no federal aid to internal improvements, and they called for no national bank. The Know Nothing Party, or the American Party, also ran a candidate, Millard Fillmore. And the campaign evolved into two separate contests: Buchanan versus Fillmore in the South, and Buchanan versus Fremont in the North. Buchanan won the South, while Fremont won the upper North with a 60% margin of victory in the popular vote. So the lower North states of Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, and New Jersey, that's where the real struggle will take place, because combinations of these states plus the solid South will give the presidency to Buchanan. The Democrats concentrated their efforts in the lower North by presenting themselves as saviors of the Union and Republicans as extremists. They painted the Republicans as a sectional party and as defenders of black people. James Buchanan said, "The black Republicans must be boldly assailed as disunionists, and this charge must be reiterated again and again. Southerners threatened to secede if Fremont won the election." Robert Toombs said, "The election of Fremont would be the end of the Union and ought to be." Virginia Governor Henry Wise said, "If Fremont is elected, there will be a revolution." Virginia Senator James Mason said, the South should not pause but proceed at once to immediate, absolute, and eternal separation." Now, Frederick Douglass, the former slave and current abolitionist, he declared that Fremont's election would, quote, "prevent the establishment of slavery in Kansas, overthrow slave rule in the Republic, and put the mark of national condemnation on slavery." The Republicans also go on the offense. They blame the Democrats for bleeding Kansas and the caning of Charles Sumner and the attempt to spread slavery to the territories. Buchanan ends up winning the election. He wins in a landslide. He wins the South and the lower North. After the election, James Buchanan still has to deal with bleeding Kansas. Eventually, two constitutions are written and adopted in Kansas, and each side tried to get Kansas admitted as either a free or a slave state. The free constitution was the Topeka Constitution, and the slave constitution was the Lecompton Constitution. Now in Washington, Republicans control the House and Democrats control the Senate. So as a result, neither party gets their wish in admitting Kansas as a free or a slave state. But President Buchanan does petition Congress to admit Kansas into the Union under the Lecompton Constitution. Now he's opposed by fellow Democrat Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas knew the elections in Kansas had been a sham, and accepting the Lecompton Constitution would make a mockery of the concept of popular sovereignty. Douglas also believed the Lecompton Constitution would hurt the Democrat Party in the North because of the way it was rammed through in Kansas. Democrats in the North could go either way on slavery in the territories. If you remember, they had supported the Wilmot Proviso, which barred slavery from the Mexican Cession, but they had also supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and opened Kansas and Nebraska to the possibility of slavery. What Northern Democrats couldn't stand for was popular sovereignty to be made a mockery of, and that's just what pro-slavery advocates had done in Kansas. Though many Southerners had supported Douglas because of Kansas-Nebraska, Douglas's opposition to the Lecompton Constitution made Southern Democrats turn on him, and it would cost him dearly when he ran for president in 1860. Ultimately, the Lecompton Constitution was defeated in Kansas. Kansas ends up being admitted as a free state in January of 1861. By that point, secession has already taken place. So next time, we'll finish the road to the Civil War and fire the opening shots of that great conflict.